Well, speaking of Hollywood, it was the climax of the movie. And it was extremely exciting. You see, because this wasn't just any movie either. This was a new Star Wars movie on opening night. It was Rogue One. It was the first standalone Star Wars movie that had ever existed. And so everybody in the theater on this opening night, we'd had to work hard to get there. Like, we had, been excited about it, a year out in advance when they announced it, at least a year, a couple years out in advance when they announced it. We'd had to, get our tickets months in advance. We'd been there, sitting in line to get a seat in the theater, even with our tickets for hours that day. I mean, we had invested time and energy into watching this movie. And for like 2 hours, we sat there and we were on the edge of our seat because it was awesome and it was perfect. It was getting to the end. It was getting to the climax. And that's when he appeared. Darth Vader shows up for the first time in the movie. And every person in that theater, myself included, cheered. Which is kind of silly when you think about it, because it's a movie. Like, it's already been recorded. They can't hear us. And even if they could hear us, they're not hanging out in Columbia, Missouri. Why do we cheer at movies? I don't know why we do, but we all did. And it was exciting, and it was amazing, and it was really, really bizarre. Now, I'm going to have to explain this in a way that I know that some of you guys love Star Wars, and some of you guys don't. Like, for some of you guys, Star Wars is that thing that those nerds watch, and that's fine. That's good. I own that. I'm fine with that. So I'm going to explain this in a way that everybody can understand, okay? So it was a bizarre thing for us to be cheering for Darth Vader at this moment, because, you see, the story of Star Wars is essentially the story of two camps. You have your magic wizards, and you have your space Nazis. That's what this movie essentially is. The magic wizards, those are the Jedi. Okay, they wear the cool robes. They have the light side of the Force. They whether it's the Republic or the Resistance or the Rebellion, they're always on the right side that begins with the letter R. Always. They're always on the good side. And then you have the space Nazis, the Empire, the Sith, okay? And they're oppressing the galaxy. They're trying to enslave everybody. They're very obviously the bad guys. You can tell because when they come on the screen, the music shifts into something in a minor key. Like, it's extremely blatantly obvious who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And yet we cheered for Darth Vader, who is basically Space Hitler, as the leader of the space Nazis. And that's odd, because I wouldn't think that, like, we would root for real-life Hitler or cheer for real-life Hitler if he showed up in a movie. And yet we cheer for Space Hitler as he shows up in a movie. On top of that, we put Space Hitler on, like, T-shirts and action figures and comic books and novels and lunchboxes and backpacks, and we get tattoos and we dress up like him at Comic-Con, and you go to Halloween and kids all dress like little Space Hitler. And they come to your door and they say, trick or treat, and you say, oh, that's such a cute Darth Vader, but what you mean is, that's such a cute Space Hitler, is what you mean. And I'd like to think as humans we wouldn't do that, because we know that, if it was real Hitler, we would not, dress as real Hitler, have little Hitler action figures. We wouldn't do that, because we know that Hitler is bad, but Space Hitler we cheer for. And I'm not attacking anybody else. Like, I did it too. I got real excited, I love Star Wars. I was there. I will continue to be there as all these movies continue to come out. Like, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not throwing stones. I'm saying us collectively as a society cheer for Space Hitler, and it's odd. Because we just do I don't know what it is. Like, maybe it's because at the end of, his story, we know that he turns and he's, he ends up not being a bad guy anymore. But that doesn't really explain, like, all the times before when he is a bad guy. And maybe it's just that, we're just like animals who like shiny things, and his suit looks awesome, and it's super shiny. So maybe that's all it is, like we just like the shiny stuff. But I think part of it is we do a terrible job of identifying the good guy and the bad guy in anything. We do a terrible job of figuring out who is the good guy we should be rooting for and who is the bad guy we should be rooting against. We're just very bad at that as people. And I think that in the Bible, the same thing is true. And for this, I totally know who to blame, and that's me and other preachers and other teachers. Like, we are totally to blame for this part of it. Because what happens is this. The Bible's a very complicated book. It's actually a very complicated series of books. And if you look through the Bible, if you try to understand the scriptures, you'll find that there's so much background work, there's so much contextual work, there's so much history, there's so much theology. Especially at this point in time, we've got 2,000 years of Christian thinkers that have told us how we should be thinking about these passages, how we should be understanding them. Prior to that, we have thousands of years of Jewish rabbis and Hebrew thinkers talking about their scriptures. And so when you can simplify something, like if I, as a preacher, and other teachers and pastors, if we can simplify an idea, we're going to do it. And so one of the ideas that we've tried to simplify, one of the things we've tried to share with people is basically this. If you're on the side of Jesus, you're basically a good guy. Disciple, family, friends, guy just hanging out, person being healed, person, eating at the Last Supper, person eating when he's feeding the 5,000, whoever it is, we tend to think, okay, those are the good guys. They're on the side of Jesus. And on the other hand, we think, oh, the bad guys, they're the people who are against Jesus. Those are the people who oppose Jesus. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders of Israel, the Romans, etc., etc. And those categories work really well as stereotypes. They do. They work really well. Like, in general, you're going to be just fine if that's what you go with. And that's why we teach it. It's shorthand. It generally works. But the truth about stereotypes is this. Every stereotype has an exception. And every stereotype has a context in which it falls apart. And the stereotype that falls apart here in this context is simply looking at things from the perspective of somebody that's not you. You see, to us, it's very simple to see the good guys and the bad guys. But that's because we're not first century Hebrews. That's because we're not living in Israel in the first 25, 30 years of the millennium. We're not doing that. And so for us, we see things very differently than they do. So I want to paint a picture for us this morning to help us to understand who the good guys and the bad guys really and truly were in the context of first century Israel. And so to get us in that frame of mind, I need you to imagine that you are a Jewish person living in Israel in the first century. And what that means is that you are a Jewish person living in Israel in the first century under Roman occupation. So imagine, do your best to imagine that you are no longer an American. You do not live in a country with freedoms. Freedom of speech is gone. Freedom of religion, also gone. The right to bear arms, protect your family, also gone. The right to have a fair trial, also gone. You imagine a right and a privilege you have as an American right now, it doesn't exist for you as a first century Hebrew. And the reason is pretty simple. One day, the most powerful and most tyrannical empire in the history of the world showed up and conquered you. Now, the war wasn't a clean thing. It wasn't like they showed up, they won a battle, and everybody said, oh, okay, that's fine. No, that's not what it worked. They came and they conquered and they subjugated and they enslaved and they oppressed and they set up their systems and people kept fighting back. So while you live in Roman-occupied Israel, you also live in a perpetual war zone. Always. Because people are always fighting back. There's always these little skirmishes. There's always these pockets of people who think it's better to fight back and die than to live as essentially prisoners. And so you're living in a perpetual war zone with no freedom and no rights. So that's how you live. And what that means is on a day-to-day basis, really anything can happen. The biggest thing that can happen for you is that the Romans can show up at any moment. It's in their law. They can show up at any moment and force you to help them. So it's 2 a.m, and Romans come and knocking on the door, and they say, we need food and shelter and clothing and quarter. We need a place to stay for the next few days. You can't say, hey, my kid's got basketball practice in the morning. I'm trying to get some sleep. It's daylight savings time. Can you come back another day? That's not how this works. The answer is, yes, please come in, or you die. Pretty much is the answer. And if that never happens, you also at all times have to pay exuberant taxes. Whether anybody comes and knocking on the door or not, you always have to pay taxes. And when I say pay taxes, I don't mean like you go to like an accountant or you go to H&R Block and you fill out something, then you get like a tax return at the end of the year. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, at any moment, the Romans can say, hey, we need to do a new census. We need to do a new accounting of everybody. Go travel all across the country, and then at some point go ahead and, go there, and we'll make sure you're paying your taxes. Like you have to travel. You have to pay for the privilege of being enslaved, is what I'm trying to say. You might imagine this is not a very fun situation. And so you think, oh, well, there's pockets of rebellion, there's all of this, we'll fight back and maybe we'll win. Well, the problem is this: the Romans are the most powerful people in the history of the world at this point. And on top of that, you're not, because you're Israel and you don't really have much of an army. And also, if you have any hint of rebellion, it's not like, they give you, a humane death. Like, for them, the death penalty is nailing you to 2 pieces of wood and letting you hang out in the elements naked until you die of starvation or shock or something else horrible. We call that crucifixion. Happened to Jesus. So it's a bad situation. And on top of that, so you've accepted your fate. This is horrible. You're trying to live day to day. But I don't know if you're like me at all, but like if you're like me, there's certain things that really get under your skin. Like it's one thing for somebody to mistreat you, but it's another thing for somebody to mistreat you and then claim that it's for your own good. Like they claim the moral high ground while mistreating you. That's the worst. And maybe it's because I'm an American and we don't have real problems, but like that to me is the worst thing. So when I think about the first century, like maybe the worst part of this is with all of these problems, no freedom, the Roman soldiers can come at any time, you've got all this taxation, all this stuff. The worst part is that the emperor of Rome, the Caesar, has claimed he is God. He is a son of God. He is divine. And so his ruling of you is not just for your own good, but it's God's will. That's your life. So now imagine there's a group of people. And this group of people represents not Rome, but your heritage. They represent who you used to be. They represent what you will be down the road, God willing. They tell you about the law of God, which came from God giving the law to Moses when, after they were slaves in Egypt, God set them free. The law is not an oppressive thing at all. The law is a symbol of hope for people who want one day to be free again. They're the keepers of that law, the preservers of your history. They tell you about the days of old when God rescued you and God helped you and God made it so that you were special. Because the one thing you are not as an Israelite in ancient Rome is special. But what you are in the stories of these people is special. God chose you. He rescued you. He saved you. He protected you. You were his holy nation. And so as they tell you these stories, it gives you hope. It gives you peace. It gives you a chance to dream about a future without Rome. And so they lead you in worship in the temple. They lead you through sacrifices, the same worship, the same sacrifices of your ancestors, and you feel like yourself again. Maybe for the first time if you were born in this world. You feel good because you feel like yourself, and it gives you hope. Maybe most tangibly, when the Romans came and set up a system, they said some people can rule a little bit. And so these people had that ability. And so even if you're not all that, I don't know what the word is, romantic about the past, optimistic about the future, even if that doesn't speak to you at all, what does speak to you is these guys can get something done. They can go to the Romans and demand some level of rights. They have some level of autonomy, a little bit of authority. And so if you're a mother in ancient Israel, there's not much more that you would want for your son than for them to grow up and bring peace to their people, and bring hope, and have some level of autonomy and have some level of a remembrance of the past. And what I'm saying is you would want your children to be a Pharisee or a Sadducee or someone in the Sanhedrin. To first century Hebrews, these are not the bad guys. To us, they always are, because the Pharisees are the ones that tried to get Jesus killed. To us, that's the way it is. But to first century Hebrews, they are the ones who are remembering their past. Imagine, again, you have no identity of your own. You've been conquered, and these people are telling you about the time that God used to be on your side and one day will be again. And when you go to the temple and you're served by the Sadducees, you are reminded again of when your people were great and when they might be great again. These are not bad guys. And you know what's interesting? Maybe we've just dirtied the water too much with some of our stories, but even from a Christian perspective, these guys aren't bad guys. I mean, Nicodemus, he goes to Jesus, John chapter 3, that whole John 3:16, that's spoken to a Pharisee. A Pharisee went and talked to Jesus, and the most famous saying that we've ever heard is a conversation between Jesus and a Pharisee who becomes a Christian. Later on, Jesus gets killed. He's buried and all that, and the burial paid for, provided for by a guy named Joseph. He was from a town called Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea is a Pharisee who ends up a disciple of Jesus. Most famously, almost your entire New Testament was written by a Pharisee. His name's Paul. He was a Pharisee. And you think, oh, well, he used to be a Pharisee. But the funny thing is, if you read his writing in the New Testament, he doesn't look back at being a Pharisee and look at it as a shameful thing. He looks back pridefully. He's bragging about being a Pharisee. Because while to us, if I say Pharisee, that's shorthand for the bad guy of the New Testament, to first century people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, these were people that were beacons of hope. These were people who in a world of war and bloodshed and oppression, of Roman tyranny, these were the good guys. And the same cannot be said and should not be said for some of Jesus' disciples. Some of Jesus' disciples were tax collectors. And you know, we have the hardest time with this. Because yeah, nobody likes paying their taxes. Okay? And so we think, oh, a minor annoyance. Because we're all kind of annoyed at taxes. We just read our irritation with taxes into the Bible and think, oh yeah, our irritation sort of mirrors their irritation. And that is in no way, shape, or form remotely accurate. You see, because, again, picture yourself in this world. Now imagine that as you live with no rights, as you live without anybody in the world giving you any chance to be anything you want to be, as you live under occupation and tyranny by a guy who says he's God, as this is where you live, imagine that some of your people, Hebrew people, people just like you and your family, people who look like you and act like you and are you, imagine that they decided, I know, this tyranny and oppression is an opportunity for me to make money. And they turned their backs on you as a people. They became traitors, and they went to go work for the Romans as the people who collect your money on behalf of the Roman Empire. I'm not sure I'm doing a very good job of explaining this, so here's what I need to do. I need to talk about something a little controversial for a second. If you get mad, cool, that's what I'm looking for. Remember this NFL season when a whole mess of players decided they didn't want to participate in the National Anthem? Like either they stayed in the locker room or they kneeled. You know, they knelt during the National Anthem. And, you know, they said that they were protesting racism and, you know, unjust actions by terrible police officers across the nation. They were trying to make a point. They were trying to bring some message to light. That's what they were trying to do. And you know how, like, nobody heard that at all? And all they saw was the offense of what they were doing? Because while they may have had a great point, to so many people, the way they were protesting was going against something so sacred. Remember that? Remember how, like, even our president got involved? And that just seemed to make things worse. It's like gasoline on a fire. And remember how the point that was made was that the American flag and the anthem it's not just any symbol. You know, this is a symbol that people have bled and died for. Soldiers, veterans, troops, not just in history, but all around the world right now, people laying their lives on the line for our ability to pledge allegiance to this flag and this country that's wonderful and beautiful and an incredible place to live. Remember, we don't really have problems. I mentioned that earlier. And on top of that, it's not just going against, a symbol. It's going against real people. You guys remember that? And you remember how, it just became this massive, massive issue. Because it was disrespectful to everything we stand for. You probably remember that. And if you remember that, you might have very strong feelings about that. In fact, you might be somebody who totally agrees with the outrage. To you, absolutely, and by the way, I'm passing no judgment. You feel how you want to feel. To you, maybe, for you, this is something that was just, protest on your own time, protest when you want to do it, but don't disrespect the flag. Don't do that. Don't do that. That is just crossing a line. It's disrespectful. It's not right. If you don't like it here, you can go somewhere else. Maybe that's you. And if so, good. Hold on to that feeling. And if that's not you, maybe you look at this and you think, this is all silly. It's just a song. It's just a flag. It's just a symbol. We're not disrespecting troops. Heck, half the troops didn't care. They were coming out and saying it's not a big deal and all this stuff. It's political theater and you have all this stuff. Okay, great. You don't feel anything towards it? Fine. I'm going to guess you're an empathetic human being who can think how other people might feel, right? You're not going to tell me you're not, at least. So pretend like you are and pretend that you can put yourself in the shoes of someone else and imagine how they might feel during this. And if you need help, just maybe think about the systemic racism that does exist, that they were protesting, that is horrible. Maybe there's that. You can think about how terrible you feel about these things. If that's you, great, hold on to that feeling. Maybe the fact I'm talking about this right now is making you a little upset because, man, I don't want to think about this at church. Don't talk about politics at church. Stop it. Great, hold on to that feeling. And now, take that emotion that you're feeling, take that conversation, take that problem, take that emotion, and multiply it by about 1 billion. Because here's the truth. You're allowed to have an opinion. You're allowed to post it on Facebook. You're allowed to share it with whoever you want to share it with. That's sort of the whole, America is cool thing. A lot of this is theoretical, quite frankly. Because you know what? Our flag is still flying. Still is. Whether somebody wants to kneel for it or sing towards it, it's still flying at least. And our troops, they're still the most powerful, best trained force in the world. So our outrage, however much we feel it, in so many ways it's theoretical. But imagine that those troops you don't want to dishonor are all dead because they were conquered by a foreign army. And that flag you love so much, you pledge allegiance to, has been burnt and it's gone. And you're angry. And your life is terrible because you live in tyranny. And you're looking for people to commiserate with. At the very least, you want other Hebrews to feel how you feel, Because we've gone through. We've at least been at that place. At least I know if I am living under tyranny and you're living under tyranny, at least we can find solace in one another, right? But when you go to your neighbor's house, that dude has decided he's making money off of it. He benefits from the flag being gone. He benefits from the dead Hebrew troops. It's to his benefit for your nation to fail. And every time he knocks on the door asking for your taxes, man, that feeling that we feel about patriotism and everything sacred and dear to us, that feeling, it just lights us on fire. That's how the tax collectors were. They're the bad guys. If you're a mother, you're praying your son turns into anything but a tax collector. Anything's better than that. If you have an ounce, a shred of honor, dying at the hands of the tyrant is better than joining him and making money off of the suffering of your people. And yet these people did exactly that. All that said, now we're ready to read a parable that Jesus told one day. And now maybe we're a little bit ready to see it through the eyes of an ancient person. So the Gospel according to Luke. Here's what we read. Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their righteousness, and they scorned everyone else. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee. The other one was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself, and he prayed this prayer. I thank you, God, that I am not like those other people. Cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I am certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give you 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance, and he dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. I tell you, the sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this story doesn't really preach well, I'll be honest. This is one of those things that as a preacher, as a teacher, it's one of those things, it's so self-evident to us, you know? It's so self-evident because in our minds, the Pharisees are the bad guys, the tax collector is a good guy. Remember, every time you read, this will be a fun thing to mess with your head a little bit. Every time you read the gospel according to Matthew, that guy's a tax collector. So anything you feel towards, traitors of your people who disrespect troops and the flag, multiply it by 1 billion, and then know you're reading his writing in the first gospel in the New Testament. Matthew's a tax collector. We know the tax collectors are fine. Lots of tax collectors are Jesus' disciples. We know that. They're the good guys. Pharisees are bad guys to us. But this story becomes absolute lunacy, provocative and controversial, and really, really messing with your head when you understand how they saw things. The Pharisees are good guys. The tax collectors are not. In a way, if you are an oppressed person, the Pharisees are the ones who stand with you, the oppressed. They are the champions of the oppressed. The Pharisees are. The tax collectors are the champions of the oppressors. They're the ones defending the Caesar. They're the ones joining the Caesar. So Jesus tells a story in which the people who champion the oppressed don't win. And the people who champion the oppressors do win. It's no wonder Jesus was sort of unpopular. It messes with us. Because at the end of the day, when you look at this, and again, I know, it's tough because we know we should be, be humble, I know. But when we look at this prayer, think about it from their perspective. What is so wrong with the Pharisee telling God, God, thank you I'm not like the tax collector? It sounds a little arrogant, but think about what the tax collector is. God, thank you I'm not a traitor to my people. That's a fine prayer to pray, guys. Don't be a traitor to your people. God, I thank you that I'm not benefiting from the oppression of millions of people around the world. Again, super great prayer to pray. All this Pharisee is doing is echoing what his mom prayed for him. And you know what the tax collector says, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner? My goodness. Talk about underselling the point here. You know, one of the most toxic things, I'm just going to go ahead and say this is a little aside from the sermon. One of the most toxic things we as the church have done is teach people that all sins are the same. One day Jesus talked about how one guy's sin was greater than the other, and that's pretty much the nail in the coffin to the idea that all sins are the same. They're not. You're not Hitler. Congratulations. High five. You're not that bad, okay? So let's stop with that nonsense. That can lead to all sorts of toxic theology down the road. But we are all equally sinners. Our sin might not be equal, but we're all equally sinners. We all do make mistakes. This Pharisee saying, I'm a sinner, man, he is not selling that point very well. He's not really saying what the truth is, which is, I'm like the worst sinner in this entire nation. Everyone hates me, and they should. It's funny, even Jesus calls him a despised tax collector. Like, Jesus isn't even trying to be like, well, he's kind of a good dude. Nope. Jesus says he's despised. There's a reason for that. This story messes with us, and the more we think about it, I think the more it does mess with us. Jesus takes the side of the oppressor over the oppressed. So what are we supposed to learn here? Well, the first thing we're supposed to learn is I think, something very neat. For all their differences, the Pharisee and the tax collector are both at the temple. They're both at the temple, praying. Which means the temple was a place that was an open invitation for everybody, good, bad, in between. Everyone was welcome because in God's eyes, everyone is welcome. You see, we're the ones that make things about good guys and bad guys. God just sees guys. We look at the Pharisee and say, oh, well, he's a hero. We look at the tax collector and say, he's a villain, or we flip it if we're in the modern world. But either way, that's not how God operates. God says everyone is welcome to come. Everyone can come to the temple. Everyone can pray. Everyone can be here. No matter how you feel, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how you've suffered, no matter what, you are welcome here. God welcomes the oppressed as well as the oppressor. But what God is looking for, what God looks for, is an attitude that properly reflects who he is and who we are. You see, at the end of the day, I believe, if you look at this story, that if there was one thing that the tax collector and the Pharisee could agree on, it's this. Neither one of them thought that the tax collector should be there. The Pharisee looked at that guy and said, what is he doing here? Why do I have to pray next to that guy? And I'm not sure the tax collector felt any better about himself. I mean, we see Matthew immediately repenting, immediately taking a chance to be somebody different when Jesus shows up. And I mean, he's not the only guy, but we see a guy named Zacchaeus in the Bible, and we can see who Zacchaeus is. That man is a man filled with self-loathing. I mean, being a traitor to your people takes a toll on who you are. And I know we're not looking for, sympathy for the worst of humanity, but it does take a toll. I'm not sure he thought he was worthy to be there at all either. And yet God believed they both were worthy. And if there's anything this story confronts me with, it's this. If I'm being brutally honest, there are people in this world I don't think are worthy of love. And that's hard to say, but it's the truth. And my list of people might be very different than your list of people, but I bet you have a list too. And yet God disagrees. And that's really important because if I'm honest, sometimes I think I'm the one that is not worthy of love and compassion and mercy. And God disagrees with that too. God says everyone is welcome. When we have an attitude of submission towards God, of saying, I want what you have, I want to be part of your kingdom, God accepts us exactly as we are, exactly who we are. And the transformation that occurs to making us the people he knows we can be, it's a lifelong endeavor. The question is, when we come to God, do we come to God assured of our own righteousness? Have we believed it when people say we're the good guy? Or can we recognize that we ourselves are a problem? At the end of the day, that everyone on every side of every talking point has a point. And man, does that just make me super unpopular. Everyone has a point on every talking point. It may not be a good one, but everybody has a point. And so often we can't see other people's points because we're too busy believing that ours is intrinsically good and theirs is intrinsically bad. We can't stop for a second and think about how we ourselves on a daily basis contribute to the systems of the world that hurt people. Do a little bit of reading and research. And for all that is wonderful about our life here, simply by existing, we harm others. And I'm not saying that I have a solution to that. I'm not saying I can change some of this stuff, but I can at least be aware of it. and be humble enough to recognize that I'm not better than anybody else, and I'm not worse than anybody else. And that list in my head of people that are not worthy is nonsense. And any list that I'm on that maybe other people have or myself, that's also nonsense. The temple was a place for the Pharisee and the tax collector, the oppressed and the oppressor. And that's the gospel, is the equal value of us all and the equal love God has for us all and the equal invitation God has for us all. This morning, our 6th week of our series called The Stories of Rabbi Jesus. And this story really I'll be honest, this really messes with me as I look at this. It messes with my ideas about what I believe about the world and what I think about the things that go on and who I think is willing and worthy and able to be here. But at the end of the day, our 6th lesson is this. We are all equally in need of humility, so we may embrace the love God has for us all equally. We are all equally in need of humility, so we may embrace the love God has for us all equally. One of the greatest flaws of people is we are terrible at identifying the good guy and the bad guy. We cheer at Darth Vader. We put him on backpacks. We get him tattooed on us. We dress like him at Comic-Con, play with him in action figures. We love Darth Vader. Terrible at identifying the good guy and the bad guy. But maybe the worst thing that we are, even worse than that, is we're terrible at believing there are good guys and bad guys. Every bad guy has good things about them. And every good guy has bad things about them. And just so I'm being clear, when I say guy, I mean it in a completely universal way. I'm not just talking about men, ladies too. Everybody has good and bad. Everybody. And yet we have a God who is only good. He calls us to be our best, but it takes humility. The Pharisee was right. That's what's hard about this. The Pharisee was totally right to be thankful he was not a tax collector. Completely, objectively. And maybe not objectively, but I know you think you're right to be glad you're not the people you don't like. And I know that because I know that I'm right to be glad I'm not the people I don't like. But being right has nothing to do with it. Being humble enough and gracious enough and compassionate enough to be inclusive to everyone and to come to God and say, I want your kingdom. That's what it has to do with. And you know what? Jesus preached this. Jesus had disciples who were tax collectors and Pharisees and every other spectrum of the world he lived in. And at the end of the day, it got him killed. The very people he preached love to killed him. The very people he reached out to with compassion and mercy and grace responded to compassion and mercy and grace with hatred and hostility and violence and literal bloodshed. And I wish I could say, hey guys, let's be loving people. Let's be different than everybody else, be loving, and then everything will work out well. Man, that would preach awesome. But the truth is, that's not the way it works. When we're loving, the world generally responds with more hostility. And so we're simply called to be the people that God has called us to be. Regardless of the reward, regardless of the end result, regardless of what happens because of who we are. We're simply called to be people, grace and compassion and humility, knowing that God loves us all equally. And his home, his kingdom, his temple, so to speak, is open to everybody. This morning, musicians are going to come forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation to take God up on this offer, to repent and be baptized. To repent is to say, I want things God's way. To be baptized is a symbolic act of that decision. When we do that, it's like the old selves are being put to death, the new selves are being born again. The Bible makes a promise that we are new people. We are filled with His Spirit. We are forgiven, justified. We are His. Never made a decision, nice warm baptistry, let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a church home that is perfect, it is not here. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, which means we want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel, we want to grow while we do it. And we want to equally be inclusive of everyone, knowing that in humility, that God has accepted us with our flaws. And so we accept others with theirs. As we stand and as we sing.